Well, good morning, Middleton Grace. How are we doing today? You're just like, who is this weird guy up here? I've never seen him before. I am Matt Ritchey, and I'm from Nampa Grace. We actually are the church that kind of helped get Middleton Grace started, and now you guys have grown and you're in your teen years or something. And we were just like, hey, here's the car keys. You guys are on your own. And so, but I was actually a part of the Middleton launch. And I remember when Middleton was just a wee little baby, and now you guys are like awesome. I love seeing this room and how full it is. I see kids running around, I see teens running around, I see older people running around, and so this is awesome. This is really good. Oh, I'm supposed to dismiss junior hires, and I'm assuming you know who you are. Junior hires, you guys are welcome to be dismissed to your class. Diana's waving at you back there, so she'll take you where you need to go, okay? So, as they're leaving, I'm going to invite you to turn to Judges chapter 8. I'm sorry, what? Third through fifth grade. Third through fifth grade. Is that right? Have I got it? Is that right? Okay, I've got it. Okay, good. Okay. So Judges chapter 8, and while you're turning there, I know that your slide says the Abraham series. When Pastor Jason called me and asked to fill in for him today, I asked him if it was okay if I didn't talk about Abraham, and he was like, totally fine. And so we're going to be talking about Gideon this morning. But while you're turning there, I'm just going to give you a little bit about me. I've already said that I'm on staff at Grace Bible Church in Nampa. Been there since 2007, which is weird to say. I love, let's see, what do I love? I love barbecue. I love smoked meats, yes. Ribs, brisket, anything like that. And then I love fly fishing. I love to catch trout. Anybody with me? Bill, I know you're with me. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I also love Penn State football. Are you guys really Penn State fans? Or you just kind of, or you just have your own team? You're just a football fan. Okay. You're a Penn State fan? Really? Man, we did so good last night. I think we might have a quarterback. It's been the first time in 40 years, okay? And I know that because I'm almost 40, and I've never seen a guy throw a ball like that in a Penn State uniform. So optimism is bright, the future is bright, and so I'm in a good mood this morning. So anyways, so those are some things about me. I'm my actual staff position at Grace is I'm over what we call our next gen, so kids ministry, student ministry, and then I also help Pastor Keith out with some of the teaching, some of the small groups, all of that. So I love Middleton. I love all you guys are doing, and so I hope that our time this morning is blessed. If you're in Judges 8, I'm going to actually skip. If you know the story of Gideon, I'm skipping kind of the known part of the story of Gideon, so I'm just going to recap that first. What Gideon is probably best known for is by testing God through the fleece. If you've heard of that before, where God was calling him to raise up an army to go fight Midian, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to do that, so he put out a fleece, and one time it was wet, and then another time it was dry, and then and then he fast forwards through that, and there's some nervousness on Gideon's part. He doesn't want to go for sure. And then there's an army that's raised up, and then God asks him to actually whittle that down. He actually only takes 300 men into battle against Midian. And if you want to read all the details of that story, you can go to Judges 6 and read all through that through chapter 7. But if you know the story, Gideon actually leads the army of Israel, and they conquer those that are oppressing them. They win a great battle. And then Gideon is sort of set up as the leader, one of the judges of Israel. And when he first came on the scene, they gather around his house. He had torn down a place of worship to a false god, and he did it at night so that he wouldn't be caught, but they knew who it was anyways. And actually, the people of the community surrounded his house, and they asked him to come out so that they could put him to death. And then in this passage, you see after the victory, it says it's a completely different tone. And we're going to pick up our reading in Judges 8:22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." So he goes from zero to hero really quickly, right? Gideon said to them, verse 23, I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. Now, if you're like me, when you read that passage, it's like good news, good news, then more bad news, then good news. It's kind of confusing, right? And so the title of this message that this is just my way of thinking of it. And if you walk away with nothing else, here's what I believe: God uses flawed people. God uses flawed people. And I was talking to my dad, who's also a pastor. I was talking to him about this, and he said, yeah, God uses flawed people because he's got no one else to work with. We're all flawed. Everybody's got flaws. Everybody? Okay, raise your hand if you have flaws. Okay, so like everybody's hands should be up. I saw a few hands that stayed down, so I'm going to let you work that out at home. But all of us have flaws. We've all failed. We've all messed up. We have ways of thinking that aren't always right. Anybody do dumb things? Okay, like out of habit, I will make a left-hand turn in the middle of town and then hit my garage door opener in my car. Like, it's just out of habit. And like, I catch myself. I'm like, why am I hitting my garage door opener? I'm in the middle of town. Like, but I have usually a left-hand turn into my driveway. It's just sort of a reflex, okay? Just ask my wife if I've ever made any mistakes, right? You husbands, can we agree? You can mess up and not even know it. Like, you can just mess up and you're like, I didn't even know I did anything wrong. And I'm sure wives, you feel that way sometimes too, like where you can try to do the absolute, you have the best of intentions and your husband is frustrated. You're like, what did I do wrong? And so even though our intentions are often good, we mess up. And as we go through this, I think we're going to see some from the life of Gideon. See, in the beginning, Gideon obeyed God every step of the way. He put out the fleece, he tested God, but ultimately everything that God asked him to do, he did it. He went through the process of reducing the army. He obeyed God at every point, every turn. The way that God led them into battle did not make any sense. Usually, as a military commander, you want numbers on your side. You don't want to go up against 10,000 with 300. You want to go up against 10,000 with 20,000. You don't go up against an enemy with one hand tied behind your back, with a lesser force. But that's what God did. They not only attacked at night, but they had trumpets and torches. And those don't seem like the best of weapons, but yet that's what God used. And again, Gideon, his faith surpassed, his obedience probably surpassed what mine would have been, because I would have wanted to go into that battle fully equipped, fully prepared. But he obeyed God every step of the way. And that's kind of the first point of today. If you're writing anything down today, flawed people are used by God. God looked at Gideon. He saw his fear. He saw his weaknesses. He saw his insecurities. In fact, he saw his future, and he still said, Gideon, I'm going to use you to be a great warrior. In fact, he calls him a great warrior in chapter 6 before Gideon had ever won a battle. Isn't that interesting that God gave him that title before that's what he had achieved? And maybe that's what some of you here need to believe this morning, is that in spite of your flaws, in spite of your failures, God sees what he says about you is all that matters. What he says is true about you is what matters most. And so if you're sitting here today and you're wondering, like, is it possible that God can use me. If people sitting next to me knew my past, they wouldn't choose me. They wouldn't give me influence. They wouldn't allow me to partner with them to make a difference. But God knows your past. He knows your flaws. He knows your insecurities. He knows where we all fall short, but yet he chooses all of us to be here in 2023 to make a difference. Ephesians 2:10. What does it say? He says, "For you are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to walk and do good works that he has prepared beforehand." And that verse seems to be not just to a select few, it seems to be to every person who ever has lived who has put their faith in Christ. There's no qualifier on there that says that you have to be from a certain race or have a certain level of income or have a certain kind of education. No, the qualifiers before that verse are simply to put your faith in Christ and accept the grace that we just sang about. If you do that, he says that you are his workmanship and he has a plan for your life. And so, in spite of our flaws, in spite of our failures, God has said, I'm going to use anyone who calls me by name to make a difference. Now, before I move on, this isn't to say God is needy. God is not insufficient. And a lot of times when we talk about God choosing us or calling us or commissioning us to make a difference, to further his kingdom, or to walk into the lives of people around us and to lift them up, it's not because God can't do that on his own. He is completely sovereign. He is in control. He is powerful. He knows what he is doing. But isn't it interesting that he has called people like you and me into his work? The motivation for that can only be love. He wants our joy. He wants us to see what he can do through us. He wants us to believe in ourselves. He wants to lift us up. And God has called all of us to do that. Now, that's sort of the good news. Okay? Little bad news here. Okay? Flawed people, point number 2, flawed people can squander God's favor and blessings. In that passage we read, we talked, there was this odd, it took this kind of odd turn. You remember Gideon, he goes from, they wanted him to die. They were like, come out so that we may kill you. That was in chapter 6. He wins the battle. Now the people of Israel say that we want you to rule over us, be our king. We want your son to rule over us. We want your grandson to rule over us. And Gideon, in my estimation, makes the exact right statement. He says, no, I'm not going to rule over you. God is going to rule over you. And that sounds pretty spiritual. That sounds pretty good. And it sounds like on the surface that he meant it. But then the very next verse is, oh, by the way, give me all the spoils from the battle. And they do. They willingly give him everything that they found on the battlefield that they took from the Midian kings, the soldiers. It specifically says earrings in this version, and it says that he gathered about 1,700 shekels of gold, and he claimed that for his own wealth. Now, I did a little bit of math. 1,700 shekels translates to 42 and a half pounds, give or take. And the current price of gold, this morning I checked it, it's $1,940 some dollars per ounce. So if you times that by 688 ounces, which is 42 pounds, you get a total of $1.33 million, something like that. So this is a lot of money. And so you have to kind of wonder, why does Gideon ask for this? Why does he take this or request this from the people? Sort of, and it doesn't really get answered. And then it says that he took that and he also made an ephod. Now, that's not a term that I use in everyday language. Anybody know what an ephod is? Okay. I totally had to look this up, okay, because as a pastor, you're supposed to know these things. And so the ephod was, it's honestly a little bit confusing even in biblical studies. The high priest of Israel, wore an ephod. That was part of his garment. But then there also seems to be in ancient culture different kinds of ephods, and they were kind of, they could be ornate, they could be like made out of gold, or they could be worth a lot of money, but they were also used for divination, or we might think of it in modern times as the magic 8 ball. Okay, so like people didn't know what to do, and so they would go to or use the ephod or have some sort of religious leader of whatever religion they were a part of, and priest or something, and there were these stones or rocks that were part of the ephod, and they would kind of cast these as dice, and they would use these instruments to decide what to do. Maybe there was somebody like that was kind of coming to attack them, and they were like, okay, should we go to war, or should we be allies or enemies? What should we do? And they would kind of cast these items or dice, and they would use this ephod as a way to figure out what to do. To kind of simplify it, the ephod was sort of, you could think of it this way, it's the spiritual authority of the time. So Gideon he's accruing wealth, and then he takes the symbol of spiritual authority, and he doesn't put it in the place where it probably should go. It says he took it to his own city, Ophrah. Traditionally, the spiritual center of the people of Israel was Jerusalem, and they had very specific practices of worship that God had laid out for them, and none of it seems to include put this in your own place, put this in your own home, put this in your own city. So that also brings up a question mark. And then it clearly says there in the passage, it said this ephod, it became a snare to Gideon and his family. And that word obviously is referring to like a hunter's trap or a hunter's snare. It became something that pulled Gideon down. It trapped him. But then it doesn't give a whole lot of the rest of the story. It just says the story just sort of ends. And it says, Israel enjoyed peace for about 40 years, and then Gideon was buried. And then Gideon is also mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 in what we as Christians call the Hall of Faith. He was lifted up as an example right alongside of Abraham as someone who exercised faith in an extraordinary way. And so what can we learn from this? And I think that as a pastor, and this is a warning to myself, this is not just from me to you, this is a warning to myself, that God, he has said, I will use flawed people, but the warning is that we can squander God's blessings and favor if we go our own way. And it seems clear that at some level, Gideon started to deviate from what God had called him to do. I'm making some assumptions here, but I don't think it's a far-fetched assumption, because I think we've seen it play out in our culture and maybe even in our own lives. What happens when someone comes from nothing and they make it to the mountaintop, so to speak? It could be in business, it could be in sports, it could be in any number of fields, the political field. What happens when somebody comes out of nothing and they reach the mountaintop, so to speak? So often we see spectacular falls from places of success. And even in the church, we've seen pastors and we've seen church leaders and people of influence, and they've made an incredible difference, and they've furthered the gospel, and they've done something absolutely incredible through their leadership and through their skills and all those things, but yet then there's some sort of failure. And people like us, we sit and we watch that, and sometimes it's even on the news, and we're like, man, how did that happen? And there's something in us that rings true. It says, like, maybe they depended on God at the beginning, but somewhere they stopped depending on him completely. They began to look at their own skills or their own abilities, and they began to kind of replace God's power in their life with their own. Here's what I think is, I think this is just hardwired into our fallen, flawed nature. When God uses or blesses someone extraordinarily, we need to remember that the story is still not about them. It's not about us. Maybe God uses us, but who's the story about? It's about God. He uses us, he uses flawed people to do some extraordinary things. In fact, he chooses people that I wouldn't choose all the time to do things that I never would think possible. In moments, we go, man, God is amazing. He's awesome. But at some point, if we're not careful, there can be this flip or switch in our heart where we think the story is now about us. Man, God used me in spite of my flaws. He must really think I'm amazing. And then, if we're not careful, the enemy can step in, and without us even realizing it, we start making the story about us rather than about him. And I think we understand this. Success of any kind doesn't come independent from God. The fact that we are even breathing air this morning is because he has given us life. The fact that we can work or lead our families or influence others, whatever you're a part of, whether it be in a volunteer thing or a job thing or a school thing, it doesn't matter. We understand at its core level that God is the one who gives us the ability to do anything. So success doesn't come independent from God. And even though Gideon was used by God in an extraordinary way, we have to remember the story isn't about Gideon, it's about God himself. And the trap is this. The trap that I think Gideon fell into was that he began to think the story was about him. And I think that's something that the enemy tries to, subtly as he can, trap us with as well. I think it was last year sometime that the Jesus Revolution movie came out. Do you guys remember that? Did anybody go see the Jesus Revolution movie about, like Lonnie Frisbee and, like how God used Greg Laurie, and Greg Laurie is still today an influential pastor in California. I love Greg Laurie. And in fact, about a year ago, we took our students over to Boise to the Harvest event, and they had like some really loud music and I couldn't understand the words, and I sat there with my ears plugged, but the kids like knew all the words. Like, I know I'm on the tail end of youth ministry, okay, when that happens, okay? So I had no dance moves, but Greg Laurie was there and actually showed a clip from the movie because it was getting ready to come out, and it was a scene of that kind of reenacted his baptism experience, his salvation experience, and Greg shared the gospel that night. It was a powerful moment. We had students walk from like the third level up in that Extra Mile Arena down to the floor to receive Christ. It was a great, great night. Loved Greg Laurie. And I thought the movie was great. But there's a character in the movie that I had never heard of. His name is Lonnie Frisbee. And if you're like me, when you see movies like this, you Google the characters. You're like, okay, like, is this legit? Like, did they tell the truth? Like, nothing against Greg Laurie, but did they kind of spin this or whatever? And so I admit, like, I went and Googled Lonnie Frisbee, and I began to read some things online, and I'll be totally honest. I don't know what's true, what's not true. But what's true, what I can say with confidence today is his reputation is today somewhat tarnished. And Greg Laurie, after the movie came out and it was making all this kind of all the headlines and money, and it was spreading the message of the church and the gospel, he did a lot of interviews, and it was hard to ignore some of the things that came up about Lonnie Frisbee. And so he was asked in an interview, like, hey, like, tell us about Lonnie. And Greg shared his perspective on his friend Lonnie Frisbee. And I'm not going to go into any detail, but Lonnie was a integral part of the move of God that launched the Jesus Revolution. He was a person of influence, and he definitely was used by God to win thousands of people. If you follow the chain of events, to win thousands of people to Christ. But it's even kind of touched on in the movie. There's a kind of a separation between him and Chuck Smith, and then he moves to Florida, and then there's like marriage issues, and then there's rumors and all kinds of stuff. If you want to read it, I'll let you go read it. But here's what I want to say is that at the end of Lonnie's life, because he died in the 90s, the early 90s, Greg Laurie went to visit his friend Lonnie. And they knew he wasn't doing well, and they knew he probably wouldn't last much longer. And so they wanted to speak with him and honestly say their goodbyes. And so Greg and a friend went, and they talked to Lonnie, and they just encouraged him and prayed with him. And They left that meeting knowing that it was probably the last time they would ever speak. And Lonnie did pass away just a few weeks later, in my understanding. But here's what Greg Laurie said about his experience with not only the story of the Jesus Revolution, but also Lonnie himself. He said, just because someone is used by God doesn't mean they don't have the ability to walk away from it. Simon Peter denied Christ 3 times after spending every day walking and talking with Jesus for 3 years. Greg went on to recount the visit that I just talked about with Lonnie. He said it was sad when we walked out. He said it was sad. I was sad thinking about what could have been. God can give us potential, but we can blow it. I'm happy to report that in their final moments with Lonnie, Greg left feeling as if he felt secure and assured that Lonnie was right with God, and he believes Lonnie to be in heaven today. And that's maybe the we went good news, bad news, good news. No matter what we have done, no matter what we squander, no matter what we do with the potential God gives us, we always have a loving Father whose arms are open wide, and we can always walk down that road and come back home. Okay? And I'm not here to try to make an argument about losing salvation, or maybe you never had it to begin with. Some of that I don't fully understand, but here's what I know to be true, is that God uses flawed people, and flawed people can still take what God gives them and mess it up. And that is only possible is if we start depending on ourselves, and we start looking inwardly and saying, well, I'm pretty good at this, and I'm going to place God's power and his spirit on the shelf, and I'm going to start relying on myself and continue to walk through this life and try to, and we don't maybe make that an intentional decision all the time. But I do think we can squander the blessing of God in favor of God if we replace him with ourselves. And I think that's something we need to be careful about, even as Christians. Now, back to good news, okay? Flawed people don't have to blow it. Flawed people don't have to mess up. Flawed people can fulfill the purpose that God has placed on their life. That doesn't mean we don't walk through difficult times. It doesn't mean we don't walk through the desert, so to speak. In fact, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 1:8 says, "For we do not want you to become unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia." Here's a man who is sold out for Jesus. He's literally like going around the known world spreading the gospel. And in the process of doing that, we read this: "For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself." In other words, they were praying, they were literally praying for death. In fact, he says that in the next verse. "Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope, and he will deliver us again." Contrast this mindset with that of Gideon. Paul is walking through the fire. He's, metaphorically speaking, he's shipwrecked, stoned, like persecuted, put in prison, executed, literally. Like he doesn't get hit to realize his full natural life. It's cut short. But he's saying, you know what? Like, I'm never going to depend on myself alone. I'm going to recognize that even in my hardships, these are reminders that I must rely on God completely. I think in America, one of the traps we deal with is our lives are largely comfortable compared to the rest of the world anyways. And I'm not submitting that nobody here today has problems. I have things that are difficult that I go through, but compared to the rest of the world, we have it pretty good. I mean, most of us probably have a house for not just our family, but also our dog and our cars, okay? The rest of the world, they just don't have that kind of stuff. We are blessed, but so often we that translates to a spirit of self-reliance. I mean, one of our holidays that we celebrate, July 4th, what do we call it? Independence Day, okay? Independence Day. I think in some ways it's hardwired into us as Americans to not depend on God, but to depend on ourselves. We're independent. And I think there's a lot of good in that. And I love our country. I love our flag. I love celebrating that holiday, and I love what it stands for. But in the Christian life, we're not called to independence. We're called to dependence on a Savior, on a God, on a Lord who is infinitely more wise, infinitely more gracious, more loving than we could ever be. He's a good Father, and He's worth building your life on. He's worth building my life on. And He knows that's the best way to live. As I said, Gideon's story isn't clear, and there seem to be some problems, but he's still lifted up as an example for us to learn from. And whether we learn from his successes or his mistakes, it's good for us to look at someone like Gideon. And I would like to close by just talking about a word found in the New Testament that's translated faithful. I believe the Greek pronunciation is pistos. I'm not sure if I got that right, but the Greek word there that is translated faithful, here's the full meaning of that word. It says, someone who's described as faithful is one who is fully convinced that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he has become convinced that Jesus is the Messiah and the author of salvation. And if we are fully convinced that Jesus is the rock, the foundation of our life, if we really, really do believe that, then it will become obvious through our actions. Anybody know who Jordan Peterson is? Anybody know who Jordan Peterson is? Okay, so Jordan Peterson, to my knowledge, is not a Christian yet. I think he's getting there, but that's just my opinion. But and I'm not going to speak for him. I'm just going to, but I would like to share a quote because he gets asked all the time, because I believe he used to be an atheist, and he says he's not an atheist anymore. And if you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, by the way, he's become sort of a voice, not only in the political realm, but just sort of in our intellectual world. He's sort of a professor, philosopher, podcaster. I don't know how to describe him, but he is a voice in our culture right now that I think is an important voice, by the way. But he gets asked all the time, do you believe in God? And he is afraid, by his own admission, he's afraid to say that he believes in God because in his mind, he believes that calls us to such a high standard of living, and he's afraid to say, I believe in God, because he realizes the standard that God calls us to. And so what he says is, I try to live my life as if I believe in God. And I think he needs just to understand the doctrine of grace, the love of the Father that accepts us even in spite of our flaws. But Jordan Peterson said, he makes the case. He said, if you say you believe in God, it should be borne out in the way you live. It's not just in what you say. It's not just on a Sunday morning. It's not just in a few songs. If your belief in God is real, then it should change the way we live. And if we want our lives to be different, I think we just have to start with the foundation. Say, God, I'm relying completely on you. I've become fully convinced that you are Lord, and I want to live my life in such a way that bears that out. I think it's also obvious that when we think of the word faithful, it comes with this idea of dependability or consistency. You probably have people in your life that you place trust in, at least to a certain degree, because they're there for you, they care for you, they love you, they've been with you through some tough times. And not only has God called us to be faithful, but I believe he is faithful to us. And that kind of love, that kind of relationship that we can have with the maker of the universe, I believe it has the power to transform us, to not just identify as flawed, but it transforms us to really take on the identity of faithful. So many times we are identified by our past, and we look at our weaknesses, we look at our failures, we look at all the things that we've done wrong, and we say, well, that's me. How many times, I know for men, at least for me, I call myself an idiot like 14 times a week. Like, I'm like, Matt, you idiot. What were you doing? What were you thinking? Okay. And sometimes my wife will even hear me say it. She's like, that's not who you are. And I'm like, I know. But like, I really did do a dumb thing right there. So, but God can transform us to not just identify with our flaws. He can transform us to where we really do see ourselves as faithful. We don't have to live under this cloud of defeat. We can live in power. We can live in strength. Again, not our own, but in His. That's who God has called us to. That's who He wants us to be. But isn't it so freeing to know that we don't have to just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and attain that on our own? He puts His Spirit within us, and He's the one who makes it possible. And at the end of the day, He gets all the glory for it. We were just singing a few moments ago that song, Christ is enough for me. Christ is enough for me. And it wasn't in my notes, but I jotted it down really quickly before I came up, because I felt like maybe a good way to close was just to share a little bit of a story that's just has been unfolding for the past 8 months with some friends of mine. I told you I like fly fishing. I was actually fishing. I know this sounds crazy, between Christmas and New Year's. There was snow on the ground, and was with my brother-in-law, and we were out trying to catch a fish. I don't think we caught anything, but my phone rang, and I was, with my brother-in-law. And how many of you see a name pop up on your phone? You're like, yeah, I'll get that later. If it's important, they'll leave a message, right? Well, they did leave a message. And so I immediately listened to the voicemail, and I was going to just call them right back, depending on what they told me. And my wife is an ER nurse. She's worked with St. Al's for like 14 years. And so it was a family in our church, and they were trying to get a hold of Mindy. They had noticed something off with their 4-year-old son, and they were a little concerned, and they just didn't know if they should go to the doctor or not. And so I immediately sent that message straight to my wife, and I said, hey, call Wendy. Sounds like something's going on with Brooks, and they want to just get your opinion. They don't want to overreact or anything before they take him to the emergency room. So she calls them, and long story short, just like 4 or 5 days later, their 4-year-old son was having a cancerous tumor removed from his brain. Something blastoma. And so we sat with them in the waiting room for several hours while that surgery took place. We left that waiting room, and I knew, based on the prognosis, that this was not just going to be a short incident in their life. This was going to be a long journey. Brooks went through chemotherapy, all the treatments, and I'm sad to report to you that they exhausted every medical option they could, but Brooks, at 5 years old, just passed away this past Friday. And I've watched Kevin and Wendy, his parents, with 2 other older boys, walk through that as faithful. I can't imagine walking through that valley that they've been in for 8 months. But every time I went there to try to encourage them, I was the one walking out encouraged. I was the one walking out feeling like they had lifted me up. I hugged Kevin on Friday, and I said, I got nothing. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to say to you. And he's like, I know my son is with Christ. He's with Jesus, and we're going to see him again. we could sit here and argue and maybe even throw a few rocks in God's direction and say, why do you let those things happen? Cancer for kids is unfair. Stop it. Trust me. I'm sorry my anger is coming out a little bit. I've wrestled with this for 8 months. We can point that finger at God and say, why? It's not fair. You've messed up. I just rely on this fact. Timothy Keller, who also passed away this year, a great pastor in New York State, he said, if we knew all that God knows, we would do all that God does. He did the absolute best thing possible for Brooks. I trust that. I don't see it right now. I don't feel it right now. But he's faithful. And I've watched a family walk through that, and they're faithful. They have relied on God through all of this. They've built their life on him. And yes, they're grieving. And yes, they're hurting. And yes, they don't understand all the answers to all the questions. But they don't identify as flawed. They identify as faithful. That's what building our life on Christ can do, is it provides us a foundation for unimaginable circumstance. And so again, this story is not about us. As much as the last 8 months, my focus was on Brooks, the story is about Christ. The story is about him. And in just 5 short years, his story has been told to millions. I mean, I don't know if you guys know who Dude Perfect is, but they came to Boise just a few months ago, and they actually spent time with Brooks, put him on their Instagram. 50 million people heard Brooks's story. God is going to use this. I promise you, and I believe this with all of everything within me, that God is going to use this circumstance to bring more and more and more people into heaven. That's not how we would do it. That's not how we would line it out and plan it out. But God has not called us to be the story writer. He is writing the story. And he is faithful to us. And so what should our response be? To simply be faithful to him. God has called every single one of us to make a difference in this life. And I really do believe Christ is enough. But even in your darkest moments, when you're tempted to say, okay, this story is not about God, this story is about me, and I'm calling an audible, I'm deviating, I'm jumping off, this is my jumping off point. Don't do it. Be faithful. And I've watched, again, I'll come back to Kevin and Wendy, they don't regret being faithful. In fact, this is what Kevin told me. He said, I don't know how people live life without him. That's how good God has been to them.